They say every castle keeps secrets, but in the winter of 1610, when the torches burned at Countess Castle for the last time, the soldiers found something so disturbing that even the flames seemed to recoil. The stone floors were stained a deep red. The walls carried marks of hands that had clawed their way toward freedom. And in the center of the great hall stood a woman, beautiful, serene, untouched by the horrors around her, who whispered only one sentence as they placed iron shackles around her wrists: "Beauty is a burden, one I was willing to kill for." This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the woman history remembers as the Blood Countess, the world's most beautiful killer, and the truth behind the legend that continues to haunt us centuries later. The year 1596 arrived at Countess Castle as quietly as a breath, yet it marked the beginning of a transformation so profound that history would forever tremble under its shadow. Elizabeth Bathory, already known for a beauty so unsettling it seemed carved from winter glass, had just crossed into her mid-30s, but unlike other noblewomen who accepted age as a gentle decline, Elizabeth experienced it as a personal betrayal. The mirror, once her closest confidant, now greeted her with lines she swore had not been there the night before. Every morning, she touched her skin as if testing a fragile myth. Outside, the peasants whispered that the Countess was aging, that the woman whose face once felt immortal was finally succumbing to time. None of them could have known the storm these whispers would unleash. Elizabeth still held her place as one of the most powerful landowners in Hungary. After the death of Count Ferenc Nadasdy 2 years earlier, she commanded wealth, land, and armies without needing permission from any man, a rarity, even a threat, for noblewomen of her era. Politicians envied her, clergy disliked her, and her rivals feared her influence. Power, when placed in hands already trembling from paranoia, becomes a dangerous companion. Without her husband's steadying presence, Elizabeth felt loneliness creeping into her nights like a draft through the castle's stone cracks. She filled her halls with servants, mostly young girls brought from villages with the promise of work, education, and protection. People believed the castle walls meant safety. They did not yet understand they were walking into a predator's lair, or perhaps into the madness of a woman losing her war with time. During this period, one person gained a disturbing amount of influence over the Countess, Anna d'Arvulia. An older woman with a cold, serpent-like calmness, Anna arrived at the castle under the guise of being a healer. In truth, she was sharp, manipulative, and fascinated by the Countess's vulnerabilities. She whispered to Elizabeth's insecurities the way a snake curls around warm skin, slowly, silently, fatally. "Your beauty is a gift the world wants to steal," Anna would murmur at night as she brushed Elizabeth's hair. "Every girl who looks at you envies you, and envy is poison, my lady." Elizabeth listened, captivated. She had always been brilliant, but brilliance alone does not protect a wounded heart. The more she feared aging, the more power Anna gained over her. The trigger that ignited the horror is retold in many versions, but one incident remains consistent in every account. One winter morning, a young servant girl accidentally pulled Elizabeth's hair too hard while braiding it. Elizabeth, exhausted and already in one of her fragile moods, reacted with sudden fury. She struck the girl across the face. Blood splattered onto Elizabeth's hand. For reasons even she couldn't explain, she froze. Anna noticed the Countess staring at her own hand and gently placed a mirror before her. "You are glowing," she whispered. "You see, the blood of youth. It gives back what time tries to take." It was a lie, a manipulation, a cruel trick, but it was all Elizabeth needed to believe. The idea consumed her. She began demanding beauty treatments, herbs, potions, anything that kept her skin pale and smooth. She bathed in milk, smeared her face with honey, soaked in lavender oils imported from France. But none of it quieted the fear, none of it erased the whisper of time inching closer, and so a dreadful ritual began. At first, it was simple punishments, the kind nobility often carried out without question. A pinched ear, a slap for disobedience, a cold bath outside during harsh winters. But Anna d'Arvulia encouraged escalation. She introduced devices, tools, and methods she claimed were discipline, but were, in truth, perversions of power. Elizabeth justified everything with the same belief. Fear keeps servants loyal. Perfection requires sacrifices. Beauty demands devotion, and devotion must be earned in blood. By the early 1600s, disappearances became common. Girls from poor villages never returned home. Families begged for answers, but the castle gates remained silent, guarded, and unyielding. Some peasants whispered that the countess was performing forbidden rituals. Others believed she was conducting medical experiments. Most were too afraid to speak at all. Inside the castle, the atmosphere thickened with dread. The young maids slept on hard floors, trembling whenever footsteps echoed down the halls. They learned to work without making noise, to avoid eye contact, to never draw attention. The slightest mistake could mean death or worse, but Elizabeth herself was unraveling. Her mood swung violently. She went from radiant calm to trembling rage within moments. She suffered from fainting spells, headaches so severe she screamed until her voice broke, and long spells of sleepless nights where she paced the halls talking to shadows. Some historians believe she suffered from epilepsy, a neurological disorder known at the time as the falling sickness. Others think she may have developed severe psychosis triggered by stress, trauma, or inherited conditions from her inbred noble family. Whatever the cause, her mind was no longer a safe place. Her closest staff, including her trusted servant and twisted accomplice Dorit Yadorka Shentz, began assisting in her violent rituals, part out of loyalty, part out of fear, part out of the hypnotic influence Elizabeth wielded. Yet despite her cruelty, Elizabeth was still capable of surprising tenderness. She wrote letters filled with compassion, funded churches, donated to poor families during harsh winters, and personally delivered medicine to suffering peasants. It was this duality, cruelty paired with generosity, that made her so difficult to understand. She truly believed she was a caretaker, a mother of her people, a guardian of beauty and order. Her mind crafted a narrative where she was the hero, misunderstood, judged by those beneath her. But her fragile world shattered in 1609 when Anna Darvulia died. Her death left Elizabeth without her anchor, dark though it was. Without Anna's guidance, Elizabeth lost all restraint. She no longer targeted only servant girls. She began selecting daughters of lower nobility, young women whose disappearances could not be ignored. The killings became chaotic, disorganized, frenzied. Elizabeth's mind frayed like a thread tugged too many times. Then came the night that sealed her fate. A young noblewoman died inside the castle. Elizabeth panicked. Instead of hiding the body carefully, she left it near the doorway, as if her mind could no longer distinguish between secrecy and madness. When servants found the corpse, they whispered loudly enough for rumors to reach the ears of King Matthias Roman II of Hungary. The king had long despised Elizabeth. She owed him money, and her influence rivaled his authority. Now he had a weapon to destroy her once and for all. Early in the winter of 1610, a group of soldiers led by Count Gheorghe Thurzo, Elizabeth's cousin and political rival, stormed Kechta's castle without warning. Torches lit up the night, dogs barked wildly, the walls trembled with the sound of boots marching through the halls. What they found still haunts Hungarian folklore, bodies, some freshly harmed, some hidden in cellars. Some buried just outside the castle walls. The soldiers gagged at the sight. Even those hardened by war felt their stomachs lurch, and in the main hall, illuminated by torchlight, stood Elizabeth Bathory. Her expression was calm. Her beautiful face, though older, still carried a haunting serenity. She did not resist when they shackled her wrists, but she whispered a sentence that chilled every man in the room. I was never the monster. I was the masterpiece they wanted me to be. The trial that followed was not a trial in the modern sense. Elizabeth herself was never allowed to testify. Her accomplices confessed under torture. Villagers testified under threat. Evidence was presented selectively. Historians still debate how much of the legend was political propaganda designed to seize her wealth, but one truth remains: too many girls disappeared for Elizabeth to be innocent. Too many bones were found for the stories to be pure myth. And too many witnesses spoke with trembling voices for everything to be a lie. Elizabeth was sentenced to a fate more terrifying than execution. She was sealed inside her own castle. Workers built a brick wall around her chamber, leaving only a small hole for food and waste. No sunlight, no human contact, no escape. The woman who once ruled empires of beauty now lived in a stone womb of eternal darkness. In the beginning, she screamed, furious, desperate, clawing at the walls until her fingers bled. Over time, the screams faded, then whispers, then silence. For 4 long years she remained in that darkness, writing letters no one ever read, replaying memories distorted by guilt or pride. No one knows. Some say she spoke to shadows, others claim she prayed. A few believe she still believed she was innocent. On August 21, 1614, the guard peered through the feeding hole and found her lying on the floor, her face peaceful, her hands folded as if finally surrendering to the unavoidable. She died alone, imprisoned in the very castle that once echoed with her laughter, her commands, her beauty, her madness. History remembers her as the Blood Countess, the most prolific female killer in Europe. But the tragedy of Elizabeth Bathory runs deeper. She was a woman raised in violence, rewarded for power, crushed by expectations, manipulated by those she trusted, and consumed by an obsession with eternal youth in a world where a woman's worth was defined by beauty alone. Was she a monster? Yes, but monsters are rarely born. They are shaped, molded, sharpened by the hands of others until they no longer resemble the person they once were. And Elizabeth Bathory, the world's most beautiful killer, was no exception. The winter of 1596 settled over Ketch's castle like a heavy white shroud, pressing silence into every stone, every corridor, every frosted windowpane. And behind those windows, Elizabeth Bathory stood motionless, staring at her reflection as the morning light crept across the mirror. She was 36 now, and although her face still held that haunting, porcelain perfection that had captivated Europe, she saw something no one else could, a tiny crease beneath her left eye, soft and shallow yet devastating. To any other noblewoman, it would have been a trivial sign of life's progression. To Elizabeth, it felt like betrayal. She touched it with trembling fingers. "Time is coming for me," she thought. And for a woman raised to believe that beauty was not just a blessing but her very identity, aging was not a natural process. It was the beginning of death. Since the passing of her husband, Count Ferenc Nadasdy, 2 years earlier, Elizabeth had been forced to carry the full weight of her estate alone. Ferenc had been her armor, her shield, the force that kept political wolves away from her wealth and influence. But now, with him buried and his soldiers no longer loyal to her name, Elizabeth felt exposed in a way she never had before. She was still powerful, but power is fragile when one is a woman surrounded by men who believe they deserve everything she has. And so began the slow, creeping transformation of the Countess into the figure history would later call the Blood Countess, a transformation that did not erupt suddenly but bloomed like a poisoned flower, petal by petal, fed by paranoia, loneliness, manipulation, and the suffocating weight of fading youth. In the early spring of 1597, a woman named Anna d'Arvulia arrived at Ketch's castle claiming to be a healer. She was older, with sharp eyes that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Some villagers whispered she was a witch. Others claimed she could speak to spirits. But what mattered most was this: Anna understood fear, and Elizabeth was drowning in it. Anna quickly became more than a healer. She became the Countess's confidant, her advisor, her shadow. At night, while brushing Elizabeth's thick black hair, Anna whispered poisoned truths directly into her ear. "You are too beautiful for this world to tolerate," she murmured. "They envy you. They want to see you wither. They want to watch you crumble." Elizabeth, still grieving Ferenc, still terrified of aging, held on to every word. She began seeing threats everywhere, in the sidelong glances of servants, in the gossiping of village girls, in the simple act of a maid staring too long at her reflection. Envy, Anna said, was deadly. Envy needed to be punished, and so punishments began small at first. A slap for disrespect, a beating for disobedience. These were not unusual among nobility. Cruelty against servants was considered discipline in their world. But under Anna's influence, discipline became obsession. Anna introduced new methods, harsher, colder, more inventive. She brought tools Elizabeth had never seen. She encouraged degrading acts disguised as loyalty tests. She convinced Elizabeth that pain purified souls and strengthened authority. You must teach them fear, Anna told her. Fear will keep them loyal long after love fails. And Elizabeth believed her. Legends say it happened one December morning. A young servant girl named Margit was brushing Elizabeth's hair. Her hands shook, everyone's hands shook around the Countess, and one trembling movement pulled a few strands harder than intended. Elizabeth gasped sharply. Margit froze, terrified, and then Elizabeth slapped her. The girl stumbled, hit a wooden pillar, and blood dripped from her nose onto Elizabeth's hand. What happened next changed European history. Elizabeth stared at her blood-streaked hand. In the cold morning light, her skin looked pale and smooth. Anna Darvulia stepped beside her silently. "You see, my lady," Anna whispered, "the blood of youth carries life. It nourishes beauty. It restores what time steals." It was manipulation. It was madness, but for a woman who feared aging more than death, it was revelation. Whether or not Elizabeth truly believed the blood improved her skin, the idea rooted itself deep in her mind. From that moment, beauty and brutality became intertwined threads in her psyche. She grew addicted not to blood but to the illusion of control, the sense that she could command time itself, punish it for daring to touch her, and so began the darkest era of Ketch's castle. At first it was quiet. A girl missing here, another gone there. Poor peasants were used to losing daughters to illness, famine, or the dangers of travel. They questioned, but not loudly. Elizabeth began recruiting more young girls for service. She paid families generously, promising to teach their daughters sewing, reading, etiquette skills that could secure better futures. Once inside the castle, the truth was far different. Elizabeth's punishments escalated from slaps to branding irons, from cold baths in winter to starvation and confinement. She convinced herself she was teaching discipline, respect, loyalty. The more she punished, the more she believed she was shaping perfection out of imperfection. Anna encouraged her at every step. "Pain makes them obedient," Anna said. "Obedience protects you from betrayal." Soon, punishments were no longer tied to mistakes. Elizabeth would invent reasons to inflict cruelty. A girl walking too loudly, smiling too much, wearing her hair too attractively. Anything that triggered Elizabeth's insecurities became a reason for suffering. Fear spread among the servants like a silent virus. Girls learned to walk without sound, breathe without being noticed, work with eyes downcast. Many prayed every night to survive until morning, but for some, morning never came. By the year 1600, Elizabeth's mental state had deteriorated severely. She suffered from migraines, fainting spells, hallucinations, and violent mood swings. Some historians believe she inherited epilepsy from her mother's side. Others argue she was dealing with untreated trauma. But inside the castle, Anna's influence twisted every illness into justification. "You must cleanse those who displease you," Anna said. "You are chosen for greatness, and greatness demands sacrifice." Elizabeth began writing letters to ministers, scholars, and noble families, letters that showed intelligence, clarity, and eloquence, proving she was not constantly mad. But between those letters, she descended into episodes of uncontrollable violence that even her closest servants feared. Her three main accomplices, Dorothea Dorka Shentz, Alona Jo, and Janos Ujvari, served her out of fear and a warped sense of devotion. They had seen what happened to those who disobeyed. They participated because participation meant survival. Still, Elizabeth's cruelty was not constant. Between episodes, she could be kind, gentle even. She still funded orphanages, delivered food to starving families, and wrote tender letters to her children. This duality is what makes her so haunting. The world saw a noblewoman of charity. Behind closed doors, a monster was forming. By 1609, Anna Darvulia fell gravely ill. As her condition worsened, the castle grew strangely colder. Servants whispered that when Anna died, the walls themselves would change. They were right. When Anna finally passed away, Elizabeth's last barrier of influence twisted, though it was disappeared. Without Anna's guidance, Elizabeth's cruelty became reckless, chaotic, less calculated, and far more frenzied. She began targeting girls of lower nobility, a fatal mistake. Peasant daughters could disappear quietly, but noble families demanded answers. One night, during an especially violent episode, a young noblewoman died inside the castle walls. Elizabeth, panicking and disoriented, attempted to hide the body but left it in a place where servants found it at dawn. This was the turning point. Rumors reached the village. The village sent reports to the county. The county sent reports to King Matthias Roman II. The king already had reasons to seek Elizabeth's downfall. She owed him large sums of money, and her power threatened his political plans. Now he had the perfect justification. On a freezing night in December 1610, Count Georgi Thurzo, Elizabeth's cousin, former ally, and now political rival, led a group of soldiers to the castle. Their torches flickered against the snow as they approached the gates. Servants awoke to chaos, dogs barked wildly, metal clashed, heavy boots pounded on stone. The soldiers stormed the castle, searching rooms, dungeons, and hidden chambers. What they found has been debated for centuries, but all accounts agree on one thing: the scene was horrific. Some victims were dead, some dying, some barely conscious. Bones were discovered in shallow graves, blood-stained stone walls, torture devices, some crude, some disturbingly sophisticated, lay scattered across the floors. And in the grand hall stood Elizabeth Bathory, her black hair loosened, her gown shimmering in torchlight, her posture regal despite the chaos surrounding her. She did not fight, she did not scream. She simply looked at Thurzo as though he had interrupted a dinner rather than exposed a nightmare. "What have you done, Elizabeth?" Thurzo reportedly demanded. She tilted her head, calm and eerily composed. "I have done what a noblewoman must do," she said. "I preserved my legacy, my beauty, my house." Then, as if giving an order, she whispered, "I was never the monster. I was the masterpiece you all demanded." Elizabeth was never formally tried. A public trial could risk exposing powerful nobles who had benefited from her wealth. Instead, Thurzo conducted a private trial for her servants using torture to extract confessions. Elizabeth's accomplices testified against her. Villagers described disappearances. Evidence was displayed selectively enough to convict, but controlled to protect the nobility's reputation. Finally, the decision was made. Workers bricked up her chamber entirely, leaving only a small opening for food and water. No sunlight entered, no voices comforted her. The woman who once commanded an empire of servants now sat alone in darkness. At first she raged. She screamed for hours, then days. She begged for light, for mercy, for understanding. But over time the screams faded. Some nights, guards heard her speaking softly as though to someone sitting beside her. Other nights they heard weeping. Eventually, silence settled over the chamber like dust. On August 21, 1614, a guard peered through the small feeding hole and found Elizabeth lying on the floor, her hands folded over her chest, her eyes closed peacefully. The world's most beautiful woman, or its most terrifying killer, was dead at 54. Her legacy would become legend. A woman who bathed in blood to stay young. A noblewoman who tortured hundreds. A monster crafted by history. But the truth, like the woman herself, is complicated. Elizabeth Bathory was not merely a villain. She was a product of violence, of an age that worshipped beauty, of a patriarchal world that shaped her fears, of advisors who exploited her weaknesses, and of a mind that fractured under unimaginable pressure. What remains today is not just her crimes, but the chilling reminder of what obsession, power, and fear can create. A beautiful monster, just tell me. The winter of 1596 fell heavily on Countess Castle. Snow draped the stone walls like a winding shroud, muting every sound except for the slow breathing of the mountains. Villagers whispered about wolves that prowled the forest, but in truth, it was not the beasts they feared. It was the woman who lived above them, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the jewel of Hungary, the woman whose beauty remained so flawless that it stirred awe in nobles and suspicion in common folk. And yet, inside the walls of her grand home, something darker than any creature stalked the corridors. An insatiable hunger that had taken root in her soul, the hunger that had begun to define her. Elizabeth still remembered the night she first realized something was slipping within her, like a silk thread snapping under strain. It happened shortly after returning to Countess after another long absence, while she wandered alone in her chambers. She saw her reflection in a polished silver mirror, a faint line near her eyes, barely visible but impossible to ignore. She touched the line again and again, her breathing sharpening, her heart pounding. She felt as if time itself had descended upon her like an invisible predator. Her servants would later recall that she dismissed them abruptly that night, locking the door behind them, but they could still hear her whispering to herself. Some said she was praying. Others said she was bargaining. Her obsession with beauty, once a pride, now became a terror. She could not allow herself to fade, not now, not ever. Noble society had placed her beauty upon a pedestal, and she had risen to it with grace. But the pedestal had become a prison. Every banquet, every royal visit, every ceremony required her to present perfection, and the whispers, "Most beautiful woman in Hungary, even after childbirth, even after grief," grew louder with each passing year. Excellence became expectation, perfection became necessity, and necessity soon grew into something monstrous. It began subtly, as all tragedies do. Elizabeth's strict discipline of her servants sharpened from firm to merciless. She had always demanded order, now she demanded flawless obedience. When a maid accidentally tugged too sharply while brushing her hair, Elizabeth struck her. Moments later, seeing the girl's frightened tears, Elizabeth felt a strange satisfaction. Not joy, not relief, but control. It was this feeling, this fleeting escape from the terror of aging, that began to take root inside her. It grew quietly, like rot beneath polished wood, unseen until it was too late. By 1600, Countess Castle had become a place where whispers slithered through the stone halls like ghosts. Servants walked lightly, doors closed gently, candles burned with unnecessary caution, and behind those walls, Elizabeth's practices, once merely harsh, began evolving into something darker and more desperate. The Countess surrounded herself with a small circle of loyal attendants. Sanna Darvulia, a woman rumored to dabble in folk magic; Dorothea Schenz, strict and silent; Ilona Joe, who obeyed without question; and Fixco, a deformed servant whose loyalty was rewarded with cruelty toward others. The villagers spoke of these attendants as if they were witches orbiting the moon. It was Anna Darvulia who fed Elizabeth's growing obsession, whispering remedies from ancient texts, herbs that promised youth, rituals that claimed to preserve vitality. The remedies worked for a time, at least in Elizabeth's mind, but the fear of fading beauty returned with increasing force, as relentless as night chasing day. Then came the night when everything tipped beyond return. A young maid, no more than 15, was helping Elizabeth dress. In her nervousness, the girl accidentally pricked the Countess's finger with a needle. The pain was insignificant, but Elizabeth's anger was immediate. She struck the maid with the back of her hand. The girl stumbled, bleeding from her nose, blood splattering across Elizabeth's sleeve. The Countess froze. Her eyes followed the smear of red across the fabric, and something inside her shifted. She touched the blood-warm olive and instinctively rubbed it into her skin. Later that evening, she believed her skin looked smoother, clearer, younger. Whether it was delusion or desperation no longer mattered. It was enough to justify everything that followed. Darvulia, sensing Elizabeth's unraveling, offered no restraint. Instead, she whispered that vitality could indeed be renewed through the essence of youth, an idea that echoed ancient pagan practices. Elizabeth listened. She wanted to disbelieve, but the mirror offered no mercy, and Elizabeth was too afraid to lose the one thing the world cherished her for. Soon, a pattern emerged. Peasants' daughters were invited to the castle to serve the Countess. They never returned. Some were said to have run away, others were sent home. Mysteriously, the families asked questions, but who would accuse one of the richest, most powerful women in the kingdom? The darkness inside Elizabeth grew stronger. What began as small acts of cruelty escalated into nightmarish rituals, carried out behind locked doors and heavy drapes, and yet, whenever she stepped out of those rooms, she was still Elizabeth Bathory, the poised noblewoman, charitable, elegant, admired. Her duality was a twisted masterpiece. Guests at her banquets praised her glow, her serenity. They saw youth in her cheeks, sparkle in her eyes. They envied her. Little did they know what price she was paying for their envy. But the castle servants saw everything. They carried bruised girls down staircases. They scrubbed blood from floors. They heard screams echoing in the night. They were trapped, fearful of the Countess's wrath, terrified of becoming the next victim, and powerless to escape the castle's iron gates. By 1604, Darvulia died mysteriously, some claiming Elizabeth poisoned her, others whispering that demons claimed her soul. After her death, Elizabeth's behavior worsened drastically. Without Darvulia's manipulative guidance, Elizabeth slid into madness led by her own paranoia. Her husband Ferenc had died years ago, and loneliness now gnawed at her. The world outside moved forward, ignoring her grief, demanding perfection from her still. She isolated herself. Letters piled on her desk, unanswered. Invitations lay unopened. The mirrors in her room multiplied. She ordered more brought in, positioned at every angle, as if creating a hall of reflections could anchor her to youth. But mirrors do not lie forever. And one night, staring at herself from 100 angles, Elizabeth screamed. The servants rushed to her chamber door, but she refused to let them in. She spent hours alone, whispering to her reflections, begging them to show her the girl she once was. The next morning, she summoned Fixco and demanded new servants, young ones. When the supply of local girls grew suspiciously thin, she turned her attention toward noble daughters. She promised their families education, opportunity, aristocratic grooming. But the truth was far more horrific. These girls, too, vanished into the labyrinth of Countess. Unlike peasants, noble families did not accept silence. Their inquiries grew louder, their letters became sharper. And soon their patience fractured, but Elizabeth was no longer capable of recognizing the danger encircling her. She believed herself untouchable. She believed her beauty was worth any sacrifice. She believed time itself was her enemy, and that she must win the war by any means. One winter evening in 1610, as snow battered the castle walls, Count Georgi Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary and a lifelong family acquaintance, arrived unexpectedly with soldiers. Rumors had reached him, rumors too widespread to ignore. A king's court could overlook peasant complaints, but missing minor noblewomen were another matter entirely. What Thurzo found inside the castle that night became the foundation of legend. The corridors stank of iron and rot. The air was thick, suffocating, as if saturated with secrets. Servants avoided his eyes, trembling, and deep within a locked chamber, he found the horrific truth. Girls, some dying, some already dead, one hanging near the wall, another half conscious on a table. And in the middle of it all stood Elizabeth Bathory herself, elegant even amidst carnage, as if the scene around her were no more alarming than a spilled jar of ink. Thurzo's torchlight trembled in his hand. This was not the woman he once knew, the witty and warm young countess he had danced with at court. This was a creature born from fear, vanity, and pain, something twisted into a shape almost unrecognizable as human. Elizabeth looked at him with a calm expression and said, "Georgi, why do you look at me so strangely? I have done nothing wrong." Her voice wavered only slightly. It was the voice of a woman convinced of her own righteousness. Thurzo wanted to arrest her on the spot, but the political consequences were dire. She was a Bathory, a name too powerful for courts, too influential for simple justice. Bringing her to trial would damage alliances, tear through noble families, and perhaps even destabilize the kingdom. So Thurzo made a choice, one that would haunt him. Elizabeth would not face a public trial. Instead, she would face silence. Within days, she was sealed inside a set of chambers in her own castle. bricked in, with only a small slot for food and water. Her servants were executed or imprisoned, her estates were seized, her legacy was already stained, but Thurzo visited her once more before leaving her to her fate. She asked him, "Do you believe the rumors? Do you believe the lies they speak of me?" Thurzo looked at her, a woman who once radiated life, intelligence, charisma, now a shadow of herself, yet still clinging to her beauty even in captivity. He answered softly, "I believe what I saw." Elizabeth's eyes, once brightly alive, dimmed. For the first time, she understood that her world had collapsed beyond repair. There was no mirror now, no servants to impress her, no admirers to validate her beauty, only stone walls, only silence. Only the echo of a life she had destroyed with her own hands. Years passed slowly. The once bustling castle grew quiet. Villagers avoided it. Birds rarely perched near its towers. Winter after winter blanketed its stones, burying its sins beneath layers of frost. And inside her cell, Elizabeth aged faster than she ever feared she would. She ran her fingers across her face daily, feeling new lines she could no longer deny. Her beauty faded, and with it, everything she had sacrificed humanity for. In her last months, she wrote letters, pleading letters, furious letters, letters claiming innocence, letters begging for mirrors so she could check her wellness. None were granted. The world had decided to forget her, to bury her behind stone and shame. But Elizabeth Bathory was not a woman easily forgotten. In August 1614, a guard delivering food found her lying on her bed, motionless. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but the fear that had haunted them for years was gone. Her hands were folded neatly on her chest. She looked peaceful, strikingly peaceful. As if in death, she finally accepted what life had never allowed her to face, that beauty is a fleeting illusion, and the chase for it can destroy everything. When word of her death spread, villagers whispered prayers, some out of fear, some out of relief. The nobles chose silence. Historians would later debate whether she truly committed the horrors she was accused of, or whether she was the victim of political schemes. But the truth, buried beneath layers of myth and fear, lay somewhere between human frailty and monstrous transformation. What remains certain is this: Elizabeth Bathory was once a woman of extraordinary grace, intelligence, and charm. A woman capable of love, generosity, and brilliance. But she became consumed by the fear of losing what society told her made her valuable: beauty. And in that fear, she lost everything, including herself. In the end, the most terrifying part of her story is not the cruelty attributed to her, but the fragility of human identity. How easily admiration can become obsession, how quickly fear can become madness. How silently monsters can be made, not born. And so, the world remembers her not for her accomplishments, not for her legacy, not for her nobility, but as the beautiful monster, the Countess who sought eternal youth and found eternal infamy instead. The story of Elizabeth Bathory teaches us one powerful truth: beauty fades, power corrupts, but the fear of losing love, relevance, or identity can turn a human heart into something unrecognizable. She was born into violence, shaped by cruelty, and consumed by the pressures of perfection. Her darkness was not born overnight, it was taught, rewarded, and eventually unleashed. And that is what makes her tale terrifying. Not that she was a monster, but that she was made into one.